So we're really excited to bring author and professor David Troutt to our community. He also had, as someone who lives, works, and is raising a family here, a real personal insight into the plight of New Jersey's regional equity efforts. And that's what I love about The Price of Paradise. It's passionate storytelling supported by a deep understanding of what it will take to make progress in a new stage of integration that opens up access to opportunity for many more Americans than have access to it today. I think we have a lot to learn from this book and his ongoing work as professor of law and justice at the Rutgers University Newark Law School and as director of the Center on Law in Metropolitan Equity. So now I bring to you and welcome David Troutt.
Thank you so much, Nancy. First of all, I just have to say what an incredible pleasure and honor it is to be here with you all this evening. It's always an honor to be able to talk about your work. It is rare that your work is read. It is even more rare that your work is talked about. Yeah, it is. Oh, is that better? God, sorry. It sounded great from up here. It's rare that your book is read. It's even more rare that your book is talked about, and I guess rarer still that it's talked about by communities that really struggle with these issues and are very familiar with so much of what I talk about in the book. So I want to do a couple of things in my time before you get to talking about the book. I want to give you something of an overview of the book, sort of the story that I'm trying to tell, in a way a little different from what Nancy heard in that church basement way back when, because I'm not gonna use maps and I'm not gonna use charts and tables and statistics for the most part, but instead this is more of a kind of a narrative flow, which is the way the book works. So I'll give you an overview of it, and then I'd like to read a few passages from the book. And since I sometimes stumble out of the gate, what I've done is I've written my first line, so I'm just going to read my first line. That this is a story of structural inequality through the landscape of opportunity, which means that it is a place-based analysis where the institutional repositories of racial and economic disparities in access, where we look at the institutional repositories of racial and economic disparities in access to the resources that condition opportunity. Now let me break that down. Inequalities in the news, we hear a lot about it. It tends mostly to be focused upon income inequality. Mine is not a study of income inequality. Income inequality is critically important, but in many respects, structural inequality through the places in which we live is really the grandmother of income inequality. And so what I'm most interested in is not so much focusing on inequality itself and the measures, but I'm more interested in looking at access to opportunity and the way that where we live becomes the determinant to our access to such opportunities. So that's what I mean by a place-based analysis, that rather than it being a question of where your parents went to school or a question of one's own particular economic status, it is far more often a question of where we live. And by looking at structure from 1,000 feet up, we get a different sense of how opportunity is organized in the American residential scheme and why such gross disparities as we see throughout northern New Jersey and many other places continue. So what northern New Jersey represents that so many other places represent is a love of localism as the basis for residential organization. And localism is really nothing more than the embrace of the philosophy of local sovereignty or local control. And it means that we care a lot about participatory democracy. We care a lot about the rules that allow us to control the police powers over our own incorporated municipalities. And by doing that, we have control over some of the key institutions that determine opportunity. The tax base, primarily through manipulation of property taxes, property values, land use decisions, and especially zoning. Zoning helps to determine who lives in our communities and who's excluded from our communities. Once people are members of our communities, then the sort of participatory structure is in place. It also determines who goes to our schools and what we do with our schools. Police power is primarily exercised through land use decisions and through educational decisions. It is also of course, a matter of things like our police force and our basic amenities, the basic array of public services that each of us looks hard at in determining whether or not we want to live in a particular community. Maintaining that level of service is in many respects a question of how we maintain levels of opportunity and stability. So that while many of us may be proud of the pluck and the merit that got us where we are as middle-class people, for the most part we live in communities in which the institutions and the resources they command really help to define those opportunities for the next generation. It's very hard for us to do it on our own. We do it through our friends and our neighbors. We do it through the strength of the tax base. We do it through local control. Now, local control, despite its sort of salutary history, has a sort of a negative side. And what's happened with local control is that I've argued that local control is really the jurisprudential successor to Jim Crow segregation. That if you look at most of New Jersey, and it's hard from here, frankly, to look beyond where we are at the rest of New Jersey, but if you look at a state that is as hyper-segregated as New Jersey, you realize what local control has done primarily through zoning decisions, but how it has configured segregation throughout the state and how those decisions have been blessed, not only by the New Jersey Supreme Court, but also by the US Supreme Court. What happened in the 1970s was that people began to see that the American dream suburbs across America have been deeply subsidized. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I review sort of the play-by-play of the book. But it had been deeply subsidized by a very generous American government, but on an exclusive basis that left minorities, and especially blacks, within inner cities without much access to wealth. And so, as blacks by the 1970s, fueled by the Fair Housing Act and other doors opened by the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 and 66, began to seek access to the suburbs, they came up against this wall of barriers that prevented access to these kinds of places, where the schools were good, where the property values were great, where the services were really rather extravagant, and where mobility was really a watchword about middle-class life. And so a number of challenges go up to the Supreme Court on the basis of exclusion, usually under the Equal Protection Clause, arguing that many of the zoning decisions that have worked to exclude outsiders from either participating, living in, or having any say over the direction of resources in these suburbs was afoul of the Equal Protection Clause. And in every single one of these cases, the Supreme Court answered in the negative and said, no, these are not right challenges, these are not appropriate challenges, because what is at issue here is really the exercise of racially neutral police powers, entitled only, in a constitutional analysis, to rational basis review. That is to say, they only had to satisfy the argument that this had some rational basis to further the interests of the town, and in most issues they did. So we get probably 7 or 8 important Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s which provide an edifice against the opening up of the suburbs. And this is what I call localism. The sanctioning by our constitutional jurisprudence in the whole process by which outsiders are excluded and insiders are privileged. And we live with this legacy today, and the fact that it was perpetuated on the basis of racially neutral grounds really gave fuel to the notion of colorblindness. It gave fuel to the idea that as long as we don't specify on the basis of race the reasons for exclusion in these, in this or any other circumstance, we are immune from constitutional attack. And so what this has done to the landscape is fairly evident across the United States, but most especially in the Northeast, in the Midwest, not so much in the Southwest. And then not as much through legal means, but through the perpetuation of exclusionary customs in places like the South and further west. And what I argue in the book is that the jig is up, that the disparities in opportunity that are now evident across states like New Jersey are no longer sustainable. That we really can no longer afford as regions to exclude in the way that we do for a couple of reasons. Primarily, the fact that the demographics have caught up with us. The rules on exclusion that help to create such a vibrant middle class for most Americans really benefited white Americans for the most part. And over the last 10 years or so, excuse me, demographic changes have radically altered this picture. So that what you see in places like New Jersey, and what we talked about in that church basement that night, was the emerging population growth of majority-minority suburbs. So it's no longer the case that black folks want to live only in central cities, not that they did before, but they were for the most part captive. Ferguson, Missouri is a good example of it. The area around Ferguson, the area around St. Louis is home to 91 municipalities. St. Louis County has 91 municipalities. It reflects the same sort of political fragmentation and love of local sovereignty that we see in New Jersey with its 565 municipalities. Like New Jersey, it employed decades of racially discriminatory and exclusionary practices to keep blacks in the city of St. Louis. What changed in the 1970s was the gradual opening up of the inner ring suburbs around St. Louis, in part because of fair housing laws. As that happened, whites began to flee, and you began to see racial turnover in the immediate inner ring suburbs, of which Ferguson is one. Ferguson, by the way, tried very hard not to lose all of its white residents, and engaged in exercises like this, local community institutional exercises like this, where it tried very hard to retain some of its white population. In 1980, Ferguson was, I think, 85% white. Today, it's about 30% white. That reflects actually a far less fragile condition of integration than most of Ferguson's surrounding neighbors. So what happened was blacks were leaving St. Louis for Ferguson as an area of real opportunity. They wanted to get out of St. Louis. St. Louis is a struggling city, has been for a long time. Most of the job growth, like in the New Jersey, like in our area, has moved to the jobs closer to the ideal of the single family detached home. But the tax base was in many respects destroyed by a number of factors that we're seeing here as well. The diminishing revenues from the federal government in state aid to municipalities, in aid to municipalities. State aid to municipalities has dwindled. The housing bubble, of course, and the economic collapse of 2008, sort of the nail in the coffin. So many, many more of these surrounding St. Louis municipalities faced tremendous fiscal stress, as do many here. So for every Ferguson, there's an East Orange, there's a Nutley, there's a Belleville struggling with a new population that is now majority minority and trying to do what its predecessors did 20 years ago, but without the means to do it. Median income has dropped dramatically, job growth has plummeted in the area, and everything is far more expensive without anything like the subsidies that people enjoyed in the 70s. So unfortunately, what happened in the Ferguson area is a reliance, an over-reliance on traffic regulation as a way to sort of balance the books. And so many of the towns in St. Louis County began to enhance traffic laws and increase fines, and in some respects sort of deputize the police force to go out as a revenue collection arm. Unfortunately, they were engaged in a lot of racial profiling. This increased the hostility between blacks and the police, and to some extent, the powder keg was there for the events that occurred last summer. We have not seen that in New Jersey yet, but we do experience some of the same tensions, some of the same hostilities because of demographic change, the combination of demographic change and fiscal stress. In the maps that we showed in Fairlawn, for instance, you would see that in these sort of diverse and inclusive suburbs that are closer to Paterson, Elizabeth, Jersey City, and Newark, like our own, you will see that this is in fact where population growth is greatest. So this is the future. This is America, today, basis by a generous federal government that was really inviting people to the benefits of suburban middle-class life, will not be available to this generation of predominantly children of color. And this is why we have to act now. So that's in essence what fuels the book. But that's not how I tell the story in the book. The way I tell the story in the book is probably maybe helpful to a lot of people in this audience. These are difficult conversations to have. Talking about race is hard. Talking about economics is almost impossible because we don't experience the same sort of internal constraints. We often talk about class differences with full vitriol without any sort of sense that, oh, maybe I shouldn't be saying that. We've learned to temper our language when it comes to racial difference. We don't so much around socioeconomic class. And place is not something that I think most of us have really embraced as a way of talking about differences in access to opportunity. So what I try to do in the book is, rather than clobber you over the head with maps and statistics and recitations of Supreme Court cases, is to talk instead about the assumptions. The assumptions that most of us hold that are probably central to our ideas of the American dream, and then to review them against the facts and against the kind of an interdisciplinary array of evidence and ask, do they still hold? And in most cases, they really don't hold. And only in a couple is it even close. And so let me just tell you what those assumptions are, because they build upon each other, and then I'll read to you from two of the assumptions. The first assumption is that middle-class life in America is based on self-sufficiency. It's based on self-sufficiency. That it reflects self-sufficiency sort of as an operational norm, that we are defined as middle-class people and middle-class communities by our sense of self-sufficiency. And whether we see this in isolation as just a characterization of our identity, or in relative terms compared to people that we consider to be takers, people we consider to be not so self-sufficient, but who are dependents upon our own largesse, we nevertheless cling to this as a kind of a core belief of our identity as people who have achieved the American dream. And so what that chapter does is really to interrogate that idea and to ask, how could that be? How could that be if the whole concept of a post-war middle class was based largely upon an extraordinarily generous federal government? It could not have been possible to create the single most important asset in any of our lives, the home, without a number of institutional interventions that most of us would consider to be subsidies, like the guaranteed mortgage, like the 30-year amortizing mortgage, self-amortizing mortgage, like the GI Bill of Rights, like the National Highway Bill, which a transportation bill which allowed highways to come into these communities, like other sides of the banking industry, the federal tolerance, and in many respects the endorsement of redlining. Would it have been possible to have created a suburban paradise without the contract system by which black buyers in cities like Chicago were only able to obtain loans not through a traditional mortgage, but instead on contract with the same kind of balloon payments that we're by now quite familiar with as we look at the foreclosure crisis in our own midst. Driving up the cost of housing in captive, segregated communities in the inner city, but making life in the suburbs substantially less expensive to live in if you can buy into it. The second chapter, the second assumption we look at is the question of preserving one's middle class status. And the assumption there is that we preserve our middle class status by maintaining distance from the poor. And if you think about it for a moment, this is almost something we would not even think about. I mean, of course, most of us in this room, I don't want to speak for you, but most of us in this room would not assume would not be prepared to live next to poor people. In fact, the way the chapter begins is I'm sitting on a train riding up from Washington, D.C., and I'm talking to a businessman who was sympathetic to a lot of the things I have to say, but who was very clear, I don't want to live anywhere near those people and their pathologies. I don't want to live near those people and whatever levels of violence they're capable of and their chaotic lives and all that they bring in terms of risk to me and my family. I'm sympathetic, but I don't want to live near them. But interrogating this assumption is worth Philadelphia to learn more about the context for decisions and values among people who could be called the persistently poor. I went straight into the hood, southwest Philly, where some of Eden and Cephalus' subjects live, in order to talk to experienced social workers who deal with the more tragic patterns of family life among the clients who come voluntarily to see them. One senior supervising social worker spoke for the record on the condition that I not use her real name or the name of her counseling organization. I drove into the area on a Friday evening in early November as dusk fell on the narrow groove of Woodland Avenue. Single-lane traffic caught up to and crept behind the SEPTA trolley cars, the evening rays of sunset occasionally glinting off their silver rails in the asphalt. Southwest is the absolute nowhere in the middle of the fifth largest city in the United States. It is not a conduit to anywhere you need to go. The skyline is always present in the distance, but the neighborhood feels disconnected from the city's energy. The facts on the ground are the usual monotony of chicken joints with bulletproof glass, hair care outlets once called wig stores, auto body shops, and check cashing places. Every soul is black, except the police, who peek out every now and then from cruisers. Like a lot of Philadelphia's toughest neighborhoods, the side streets are foreboding, stuck in an era decades gone, sunken row houses pockmarked by abandonment. To people who know it, Southwest is not even a little bit safe to walk around. My hosts asked me if I wanted a security escort from my car at a distance of maybe 60 feet. Where the sociologists illustrate the cultural flavor of poor mothers' decision-making, the social workers can detail where it hurts, particularly for their children. For starters, single motherhood makes actually being there extremely difficult because moms are either working and relying on others to care for their kids much of the day, or they're struggling. They're struggling with other habits that take them away physically and psychologically. Her clients arrive through the randomness of primary care visits down the hall. The nurse practitioners hear of the depression, see signs of abuse, or respond to a request for medication and send them to Sewell, is her name, and her staff. These clients are very poor, perhaps poorer than Eden and Cephalus' subjects, nearly all black or African, and often in more crisis than they know. Sewell is a black woman of elegance and stature. Two issues come to dominate her work. The first is developing productive parenting skills. This among a population of parents for whom the thought, quote, the thought of doing anything other than beating their kids or yelling at them has never occurred to them, unquote. She explains this in the corner of a soul food restaurant as we talked over a colossal collection of crab claws. The parents she deals with have trouble seeing the child's behavior as age appropriate, rather than a deliberate act of aggression or a bother. Quote, patience gets missed, unquote. Although Sewell sees some of these patterns rooted in a history of disruptions to black families that goes back to enslavement, she believes that caseworkers in other parts of the city find the same issues with their clients of other races. Quote, there's something that stands in the way of parents showing children loveliness, their innate sense of worth, Sewell says. She struggles to eat her meal after a long week of stories she won't share in detail. But you can't give what you haven't gotten, she says. A lot of parents don't know how to talk to their children. They may even see speaking gently or patiently as being inappropriately white and therefore ineffectual, unquote. But she doesn't judge or reprimand parents for their approaches to their children, nor does she see these patterns as a reflection of weak values. If I see it that way, I'm not going to be with them as they are, and I'm going to miss them the same way they are missing their kids. One of the themes that begins to emerge in conversations like this, as well as the psychological research on which professionals like Sewell rely, is fear. At least since psychiatrist Robert Cole's path-breaking studies of the untreated crises facing many children, the psychological toll that poverty takes has been part of a conversation of stress and economic disadvantage that few policymakers care to enter. Poverty brings a lot to be stressed about, but perhaps more to be feared. Sewell hears fear in the angry voices of frustrated parents and sees fear in the eyes of their children. Down to the caseworker's offer of security as I left my car, there's a constant aura that something bad can happen at any moment. I'm already back to thinking about the physiological concept of allostatic load, a function of too many fight or flight stress reactions on the body. The term reflects an overload of the normal processes by which our minds and bodies adapt to dangerous stimuli. From the concept comes a theory that an abundance of threats to one's survival demands too much from the hippocampus and pituitary glands, producing excesses of cortisol and adrenaline that trigger a range of chronic health and learning deficits. The social stratification theorist Douglas Massey introduced me to the research of neuroendocrinologist Bruce McEwen. Massey believes the biosocial effects of segregated poverty deserves more attention, especially the problems associated with young bodies formed amid allostatic load. And a conversation with another social worker, Margaret, who works with poor clients, illustrated how it develops in a child in Southwest Philadelphia. And I'll conclude with this. First, you see a very little child. We'll call him Jared, maybe 4 or 5 years old. He's standing near a bus stop on the street, and you wonder incredulously to yourself, is that child alone? Margaret, the caseworker, stares out the window as she speaks, as if she can actually see the child, and maybe she can, because this scene recurs all the time in Southwest. These streets are unsafe for a child so young alone. Any street is unsafe for a child that age, but especially here. Jared thinks so. He thinks so too, says the caseworker. He has fear on his face. As time passes, inside his chest, his little heart is racing. A man approaches and walks on. Then comes a group of big kids. The small child maneuvers out of the way, quietly trying to figure out just what to do. This time, Jared is not touched. He is not spoken to. It turns out, the caseworker says, he's not alone. Jared's mother told him to stay there while she went into a store nearby, though not close enough, across the street, in fact. Not close enough to save him from an immediate threat, and not even visible to him. She too knows this is a dangerous neighborhood for such a small child alone. Like most people here, she has very little trust for others, especially strangers. Then why does she let Jared experience this anxiety? The caseworker's not sure. She suspects it's out of a belief that her child must learn to navigate these dangers for himself. Even at 4, Jared must steel himself against fearsome threats. The caseworker calls it parentifying the child. However, the lesson will come through prolonged threat reactions, complicated chemical fight or flight responses which challenge the body to defend itself more often than it is designed safely to do. The boy may even learn to react with hypervigilance at the slightest threat, seeking to overcome it with aggression or violence before it gets him. He may read threat too great a response, which may eventually get him killed or imprisoned. But the whole street scene is a microcosm of allostatic load in its infancy. Mom is an island paradise, but mom isn't there. Jared's body is training for fear. So, I've gone way over my time. Let me just conclude my remarks with this. The book is not hopeless. It ends with a chapter on what I call metropolitan equity. And metropolitan equity strategies, in a word, ask us to look at so many of these issues as interrelated and as and more capable of being addressed effectively on a regional level. That is to say, we really have to look beyond localism. We have to see regional strength as an important interest to advance. We have to be concerned what our municipal neighbors do. And in effect, we have to make sure that the burdens that only a few municipalities bear are spread more equitably across the region. That's in essence what regional equity is. And it is also about reforming the processes by which we achieve more equal outcomes. It's a way to achieve balance in policy. And of course, I enumerate a lot of those policies in the book. The last thing I'll say, though, back to the comment about how different this community is. is that regionalism is appealing for everybody but your own community, particularly when your own community has been as successful as this community. And so in many respects, we in Montclair and South Orange and Maplewood face a bit of a quandary when it comes to regional equity as a set of reforms that we might want to endorse. Because we've worked very hard to build what we have in our own communities, and we know how few of the communities around us have followed us. And regional equity threatens that to some extent. I mean, think about a countywide school district. It would do wonders to solve so many of the issues that confront poor schools in this region, right? It would present real choice for a lot of families who cannot imagine it. But it would be very hard for members of this community or my community to go for it because of how hard we've worked to create what we have. So I leave you with that quandary because I think the whole point is to raise questions. Thank you for listening.